Hi everyone, I'm Paula and welcome to SewSpark Studio. Today I'm going to be taking the quilt blocks that I demonstrated in a previous video, the Dutchman's puzzle, duck tracks, and an 8-pointed star variation, and I'm going to be putting those together into a quilt for a baby. Another of my nephews just had a child recently, and this family has requested something more traditional and simple done with blue fabrics. It's a boy. So a more traditional approach to a baby quilt. And so I hope you'll join me. Let's get started. I'm cutting the fabrics for the baby quilt, and the template and cutting sheets are available on my website, sewsparkstudio.com. This is in color on the file, but I don't have a color printer, so it's not in color here. But I'm using a monochromatic scheme here with 5 different fabrics in varying shades of blue. This one happens to be my light. I'm following the cutting sheet right now, and I'm going to be cutting the strips that I'm using to build the blocks and create the quilt. So out of this light color, I need I need to straighten the edge here first. I need 1 2 1/8 inch strip, 4 2 1/2 inch strips, 2 3-inch strips, and then 4 4.5 inch strips. The wider strips will be used for the outer border on the quilt. So those are the pieces that I'm cutting right now. And the border strips I'm going to trim right now. So I need 2 that are 32.5 inches long. And 2 that are 40.5 inches long. And what I'm going to do for these is take the 2 strips on top of each other and fold it in half, because my board is only 35 inches long. So I'm going to fold it in half and do 20 1/4 inches. So this will be the outside border. This is the medium light blue, and I need 1 2 1/2 inch cut of this. This is the medium blue color, and I need 2 2 1/8 inch strips, 1 2 1/2 inch strip, 1 3-inch strip, and then I need another 4 2 1/2 inch strips to do the inner border. On my instructions here is also the backing for the quilt, but I actually bought one of these, I call this minky. I'm not sure this is actually minky, but something similar, very soft, and sometimes I like to use this on a back. So you've got that cotton front, and then you flip it over and you have this cozy back, and you can use it either way. So this I will cut later when the quilt top is finished. So for now, I won't be cutting any backing piece out of this particular one. These are for the inner border, so I'm going to just trim those right now. And 2 of these are 28.5 inches. And the other 2 are 32.5 inches. This is the medium dark blue, and I need 1 2 1/2 inch strip of this one. This is the dark blue color. I need 1 2 1/8 inch strip, 1 2 1/2 inch, 1 3-inch, and then I need 4 1.5 inch strips that are used for the sashing, and 4 2.5 inch strips that I'll be using for the binding. I said earlier that you needed to cut 4 1.5-inch strips, and I was incorrect on that. You need 6 of them. And so I've cut 2 more pieces. So this is 4 strips layered on top of each other, and I'm cutting them to 26.5 inches. And this scrap will be used for smaller pieces. And then this is the other 2 pieces. By the way, I will fix my cut sheet. And these 2 are 28.5 inches. And then these remaining pieces, I need a total of 6 pieces that are 8.5 inches. And so there's 2 pieces here and 4 pieces here. And those are our sashing pieces. These are the finished squares for the baby quilt. There are 4 of the 8-point star variation, 4 of the duck tracks, and 1 of the Dutchman's puzzle. And I'll be arranging them with the Dutchman's puzzle in the center of the quilt. The instructions for these blocks are all available on YouTube in a separate video, and I'll put a link in the description. I'm going to start though by checking the size of each of these. They are to be 8.5 inches, and in order for the quilt to go together smoothly, I may need to trim some of them, so I'll be checking them and trimming them if they need it. I'm separating the blocks in the quilt with strips of sashing. So I'm going to begin by sewing the sashing between the blocks in horizontal rows, and then I will sew strips between those rows. The sashing strips are sewn, so I'm now going to press these. And then these will be pressed towards the sashing. And then I'll finish pressing the other strips. Next, I'll be adding the sashing between the rows, and I have a strip for the top and the bottom as well. So I'm sewing the sashing to, right now this is the bottom edge of the quilt. So now I'm going to press this sashing. Same technique as the rows that I sewed earlier. And these are also pressed towards the sashing. And I'll press all the wrong side, and then I'll flip it and press from the right side. And now I'll finish off by sewing 2 strips of sashing to the side edges. And so essentially I'll end up with a 1 inch wide inner border on the quilt. Then I'll be adding 2 additional borders, a 2-inch border and then a 4-inch border. And I will be sewing the side pieces first and pressing outward, and then sewing the top and the bottom and pressing outward towards the border on those as well. This is the last row of the border, so I do like to backstitch on this one just to secure this final edge. And quilt sandwich is next. So this is my backing fabric, and right now I'm just going to trim it to the size that I want. So I've got my quilt top here, and I want about 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters on each side. This is a smaller quilt. If it's a bigger quilt, I leave more, because as you quilt, sometimes it moves and you want a little extra on the edges there. And so just lay this out. So that's good there. And then my table is not quite big enough, so I'm going to do a little folding here. And this doesn't have to be perfectly flat right now, because I'm going to be taking this off, because I also need to put in some quilt bat. Now you can see on the bottom here that this is quite wide fabric, so I've got some extra here. So I'm just going to trim it, and this does not have to be a perfect rotary ruler straight cut, because this is just temporary. Once I'm done quilting this, I will be trimming everything to the same size as the top. So I have my quilt top on top of the batting, and the backing is here as well, and the batting is cut to the same this over a bit. The batting is cut to roughly the same size as the backing. Both of those will be trimmed to the size of the quilt top. And then I've started pinning. I meant to video from the start, but forgot to press the go button. And so rather than take all the pins out and start all over, we're going to just continue on. But basically you want to make sure everything is very flat, because if it's not, when you start stitching the layers together, you can end up with tucks, which are not the most desired thing when you're stitching a quilt together. So once everything's as flat as possible, I start in the center. And so I started with this block, and then I worked my way out, and I continue smoothing as I go, every layer that I move to. So I did out this way. Now I've gone down and I'm heading out this direction. And so I'm just finishing up the third block over here on this row of blocks. And then I will shift down and finish out the border on this end, and then go back towards the top and work my way up from there. And once I'm done pinning, I like to flip it over and check the back. And it's not going to be 100% flat because the pins make little kind of bumps in it. But you can get a feel for whether or not that's going to sew a tuck. And this one's going to be fine. And trust me, I have repinned an entire quilt, because when I flipped it, what I thought was flat was not. So I'm pretty careful about it. All right, we are now ready to do the quilt stitching. For the quilt stitching, I'm basically going to be following the lines of the fabrics in each of the blocks. So the triangles, for example, in this one. In the duck tracks, I will do around this shape rather than doing a square and a triangle. I'll do this particular shape because that's unique to that. And in the 8-point star, probably just following all of the lines that are in that one. And so I'll start in the center, I'll go out and out this way, and then I'll do the corner ones, and then I'll stitch the borders. And probably in this outside border, I'll do something extra. I haven't 100% decided yet, but I'm thinking about doing some kind of a cross design, maybe based on the size of this square. This is 4 inches. So I might do actual squares with X's in them or something. I'm not sure. I'll see when I get to it what I think would look the best. Maybe I'll do a 4-inch square with a cross in it. Anyway, I'll figure that out when I get there. I have my walking foot on my machine. This one's a built-in one, but you can use the separate attachment as well. It works well if you don't have a built-in. I'm using a blue thread that's similar to the background color and to the color of the medium fabric in the quilt. And I have my stitch length on 3.5. It's a little longer than I would normally use, but the back is a little bit thicker with the quilt batting. And so I think it will work better with the longer stitch length. blocks are quilted, and so now I am going to do the straight lines along the edge of the inner sashing and the middle border here. I'm drawing lines for the quilting pattern I'm going to do on the outside border, and so I'm doing a kind of diamond, or it's really small squares but tilted so they're like diamonds along the edge, and I've drawn out most of it and I'm just finishing it up on this side. So I have a 4-inch border, and I'm doing this in the center, so it's an inch away from this border and an inch and a quarter from this border approximately. And I'm using my friction pen. There will be some marks left after I'm done, but I'll just steam those away. I'm just going to finish off the outside edge with a 3-step zigzag. It holds all the edges together, and I just find it makes it easier to do the binding. So the quilting is finished, and I'm doing some finishing steps before I bind the edges. So first I'm trimming off this excess that is beyond the top of the quilt. And I'm just using a pair of shears. You could use a rotary cutter for this, but usually I use shears. If I thought my edges were really crooked, I might use the rotary cutter with it, but usually this works fine. And the other thing I would do now is, if I hadn't already done so, take out all my safety pins if there's any left and check for threads, trimming off all the loose threads. And I'm also going to steam off the markings that I made to guide my stitching on the border stitching. I'm running over the border on this quilt with a warm iron and some steam, and that's just easily removing those markings that I made with my friction pen. I'm sewing my binding strips together. I have 4 strips, the width of the fabric, and I'm going to make 1 long strip. And I'm just using my regular foot. I could use the 1/4-inch foot, but this is not that much wider, so I'm just using the edge of this foot. My binding strips are folded in half with the wrong side in the center and pressed. And where the join is, I am going to press that open. Most things in quilting I press to one side, but the binding, I like to press it open so there's less bulk, because there will be several layers of fabric when I sew this onto the quilt. To start the binding, I fold down one corner so that you have a 45-degree angle here, and just a finger press works for that. And then I fold it back in half again. Makes a little pocket here, and what that does is makes it easier when we come around the quilt. The end can be tucked into that pocket and it finishes it off nicely. And then I'm starting on the back side of the quilt. I am close to a corner, but not right at the corner, because it's very difficult to get a nice square corner if you start your binding right at the corner. And I don't pin this or clip it, but if that's something that works for you, you can do that. I'm using my regular foot. This is a 1/4 inch seam technically, but I find with the regular foot it's just a touch wider than the 1/4 inch, and that guarantees that it's going to cover up my 3-step zigzag and that the edges are all going to work together because of the several layers that are there. Now I'm coming up to the corner here, and I'm actually going to stop stitching 6 millimeters or 1/4 inch from the edge of the quilt. And I usually just eyeball it. You can put a pin if you wanted, but I want to come right up to that point and then back stitch. And I'm going to cut my threads, and then going to turn my quilt, and there's a way to fold these edges to set it up for when we are folding back to the other side. So I'm going to start by folding straight up. So the edge was coming out even with this edge of the quilt. I'm going to fold it up so that the edge of the binding is even with the side of the quilt I'm going to start sewing here. And we've got basically a 45-degree angle right there. And then I'm going to take this and fold it down even with the top edge of the quilt. And I have this little triangle of fabric that's actually going to be loose. I'm going to start sewing a 1/4 inch from the edge on each side. Basically, I'm going to start sewing where I stopped sewing on the other side. So if you looked at it on the back, you would see that it looks like it's connected, but it really is 2 separate rows of stitching that come together. And this little triangle of fabric is needed when we wrap around to the right side of the quilt in the next step. Back stitching, and I'm going to sew to the next corner, and then I'll be doing the same thing again. So I want to cut the end of my strip right at this point where this diagonal meets the seam. And then I tuck this end inside and just stitch it. And overlap a little bit with where I started. To finish off the binding, you're working from the right side of the quilt. You're just going to fold this edge and basically wrap the edge of the quilt. And this should be wide enough to just cover this row of stitching from where you stitched it on at the back. If it's not, you could trim this edge with all of the batting and everything. If you sew accurately, this width of binding, 2.5 inches, should be able to wrap a narrow edge on a quilt. If you like it wider, you can cut your binding wider. And I'm just sewing very close to this folded edge. This is the area where the two pieces came together, so a little more thickness through there. So I'm coming up to the corner. So you want to fold it straight out, and what you'll have is kind of a diagonal on the edge here. And I like to use my tailor's awl to help me out, because I'm going to fold there and fold up. So what you end up with is a diagonal here, a nice mitered corner. And then I use my awl to hold that in place because it needs to be held very close to the needle. And then I can pivot here and carry on. And each of the corners are wrapped exactly the same way, so it's a continuous seam all around the edges of the quilt. And coming up to where we started, you're just overlapping your stitching and locking. Well, the simple blue baby quilt is completed. I'm not so sure about the simple. These blocks were more difficult or more challenging to work with than I originally anticipated, but I'm happy with the results. And I hope the family and the baby that it's intended for will enjoy it too. I hope this project has inspired you to try your own version of a quilt, and I hope you'll join me again at Sew Spark Studio. I'm Paula. Have a great day.